Killer of Rome by Tim Whalen. Chapter 11. As they drove toward Huntington Beach, Mike shifted in the driver's seat, his posture stiffening noticeably. Dan glanced over, waiting for him to speak.
Dan, you've been following what's been happening in Korea.
It was a statement, not a question. Dan knew it was impossible to ignore the escalating conflict in Korea and its potential to get much worse. The news reports were relentless, filling the airwaves and newspapers with alarming updates on the escalating conflict. Every day seemed to bring fresh concerns about the war's expansion and the looming threat of the great powers becoming more involved. The threat was real, even in California, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean.
Well, it's looking like we'll need more troops there, possibly on a permanent basis.
Dan shrugged.
They'll come from Japan first, and the personnel from Japan will need to be replaced, backfilled.
Dan tracked Mike's logic and saw where he was going. He started to wave him off, but Mike interrupted.
Let me finish.
Dan acquiesced with a slight nod, curious about what enticements were coming this time.
I've been instructed to offer you a posting in Japan, promotion to lieutenant colonel. No combat duty.
Dan grinned. Lieutenant colonel, huh? Japan, the land of ancient mysteries and geishas. Then he gave the answer Mike needed. You can tell Colonel Wilkerson or whoever that you made your pitch and I turned it down. His tone was light but resolute. Good enough? Mike, visibly relaxed, said,
Good enough.
Mike was satisfied, his duty discharged.
Well, that's done.
Their next stop was Lindy's Auto Service, a sprawling garage that commanded a street corner with its massive lot and bold signage. Lindy's boasted 6 service bays, each one bustling with mechanics, their tools clanging against metal in a symphony of automotive repair. The air was thick with the industrial odors of motor oil and rubber, scents that seemed to cling to everything in the vicinity. As they pulled up, Dan couldn't help but notice the impressive array of vehicles waiting their turn on the hoists. From sleek new models to battered workhorses that had seen better days. Detective Dan Kelly and Captain Mike Fiorante spotted Big Joey Campbell as soon as they approached the auto shop. The hulking mechanic's massive frame was unmistakable, even from the other end of the cluttered garage. Grease-stained and hunched over an open hood, Joey's bald head gleamed under the overhead lights. It was hard to miss a man his size. 6 feet 4 inches and over 300 pounds. Big Joey's face split into a broad grin at the sight of them. He barked out,
Hey, Peter, I'm gonna take 50.
And wiped the grease from his hands. Soon, the 3 of them were sitting at a table behind the auto shop, sharing a cup of coffee.
I tell my wife, Sue, that you two saved my ass. Tell her all the time. She's tired of hearing about it. You guys would love Sue. After all, she puts up with me.
Big Joey grinned. Mike tried to downplay their role.
It wasn't that big a thing.
Maybe so, maybe not.
Big Joey said as his smile grew as wide as a summer day.
But it makes a hell of a story.
We need to ask you a question, Joey. Answer it, and we can be on our way.
Still grinning, Joey said,
Shoot.
Where were you 2 nights ago?
Joey seemed completely uninterested in why his whereabouts were being questioned. This made the likelihood of Big Joey being the killer they were looking for, which had seemed a long shot, now appear silly.
Sue and I went to see Sunset Boulevard. Great movie. William Holden is great. It starts with him talking to you while he's face down in a pool, dead.
And the rest of the night?
At home with Sue.
Where can we find Sue?
At home. I'll write it down for you.
Half an hour later, Dan and Mike climbed back into their car outside the Campbells' home. Sue's answers had settled the matter. As they drove away, Dan chuckled. Well, Big Joey was right. I do like Sue.
Not a big fan of William Holden, though. How big would you say Sue is? She's so small.
Yeah, 4'11", I'd say. 90 pounds. After another pause, Mike asked,
How does that work, her and Joey?
It was a clear reference to the geometry and physics of the Campbells' lovemaking. It seemed to the casual observer an impossibility. Dan thought for a moment before giving a grand answer. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy.
Shakespeare? Jesus, he's quoting Shakespeare.
Dan laughed in response. At their next stop, as the car slowed on Palm Avenue, Dan's eyes jumped from the manila folder in his hands to a quaint little bungalow. The fresh paint and neatly trimmed hedges spoke of a home well tended, if modest. He leafed through the documents, his forehead creased as he reviewed the particulars of their next interview. Paul Okafor, Dan said, scanning the file. Army, corporal, radio operator. His finger traced the lines of text, pausing at a particular notation. It says there were several complaints from women about aggressive and unwarranted attention. Not much to go on. As the words left his mouth, Dan felt Mike's hand on his sleeve. He looked up, meeting Mike's hard stare. It conveyed a clear message. Stay put. Confusion flickered across Dan's features, but he trusted Mike's instincts. From the passenger seat, Dan watched Mike's measured stride as he moved up the narrow front walk. The screen door on the bungalow swung open, revealing a plump woman in her late 50s, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun. It was then that Dan saw what Mike had seen, a small vertical banner near the door, a red border framing a white field with a gold star in the center. Its meaning was crystal clear. A son of this house died in service to America. Awareness dawned on Dan as Mike halted his approach and drew himself up to his full height. The captain raised his hand in a formal salute, honoring the sacrifice represented by that simple gold star. His movements were both fluid and stiff, honed by years of military discipline. As he held the salute, Mike's eyes fixed on the banner with respect. The woman's behavior visibly changed, her initial wariness melting into a warm, if somewhat sad, smile. She gestured toward the veranda, inviting Mike to sit with her. Dan strained to catch their conversation, but the distance and the gentle rustling of leaves in the trees rendered their words inaudible. He watched as the woman took Mike's hand, her eyes locked with his in a moment of shared understanding. A smile graced her lips, tinged with both gratitude and sorrow. After a few minutes of quiet conversation, the woman rose, bidding Mike farewell before retreating into her home. At the threshold, she turned back, and Mike offered a final, crisp salute. The wooden screen door closed behind her, banging against the house and leaving Mike alone on the steps. As Mike made his way back to the car, his face was a veil of calm, revealing nothing of the exchange that had just transpired. He slid into the driver's seat without a word, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. A block later, he stopped the vehicle on the side of the road and cut the engine. From the passenger seat, Dan studied Mike, sensing the strain radiating from his friend's rigid posture. The silence in the car stretched taut, like a rubber band about to snap. Finally, Mike spoke, sounding raw and strained, like gravel being crushed underfoot.
I told her I was there about Paul. She asked me if there was news about the death benefit.
He swallowed hard, his hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel.
She didn't get the full amount. Some bureaucratic nonsense about paperwork not being filed on time. I told her that's why I had come.
Mike said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth.
It was a lie, of course. But how could I tell a Gold Star mother that I come to interview her son, Paul, about murders that took place after his death?
Dan could see anger and sorrow in Mike's eyes. Mike's voice cracked as emotions flooded him, threatening to overwhelm his composure.
She asked me if I knew Paul. I said we had served together in Rome. She said Paul's letters from Rome talked about how beautiful it was. He loved Rome.
Mike's face contorted. Rage flashed across his features like lightning on a clear summer day.
Fuck the army.
The words exploded from him, angry and bitter. He pounded on the steering wheel.
She said it was so sad, Paul dying on his way home. He would have been home in a week.
With anguish in his eyes, again he turned to Dan.
I couldn't ask her how he died. Jesus, I was supposed to know.
His grief-stricken look found Dan's face as tears welled up in Mike's eyes.
He's been dead 3 years. Goddamn army.
Spitting out the words, his voice just above a whisper.
How is it possible they didn't know he was dead? They sent me to interview a dead man.
The car fell silent again, the power of Mike's outburst settling over them. Dan witnessed his friend's struggle to regain control and was not sure how to deal with the emotions that had erupted.
Hey, I can drive.
Mike shook his head, waving off the suggestion.
No, I'm fine.
He insisted.
Just need to make a note to check on his death benefit.
Dan and Mike wove through the bustling streets of downtown Los Angeles, the car's tires humming against the pavement as they navigated the maze of construction zones and detours. The city was a hive of activity. Giant cranes rose from the ground, like the titans of Greek mythology, their long arms swinging overhead. As they reached their destination, a skeletal structure of steel and concrete loomed before them. Workers in hard hats swarmed over the site, their shouts and the banging of metal creating a racket that reverberated off nearby buildings. Dan marveled at the towering framework.
That's gotta be it,
he said under his breath, spotting a group of men huddled around a set of blueprints spread across the hood of a truck. Mike pulled the car to a stop, kicking up a small cloud of dust as they parked on the edge of the construction site. They stepped out, the smell of fresh concrete and welding fumes assaulting their nostrils. A stocky Mexican man with a leathery face and hardened hands looked up as they approached. Beneath the brim of his hard hat, his eyes took in the two men.
You boys lost? We're looking for Francis Hernandez,
Dan said, flashing his badge.
That's me. Frank, please. What can I do for you, gentlemen?
Said Hernandez, wiping his hands on his dusty jeans. As they shook hands and exchanged names, Dan couldn't help but notice the strength in Frank's grip. This was a man used to hard work his hands telling the story of years spent in construction.
Mind if we have a word?
Mike asked. Acknowledging the request, Frank Hernandez turned and walked toward a construction trailer. Dan followed Mike and Frank into the trailer, the door closing behind them with a soft thud. The interior was a quiet contrast to the hive of activity outside. A makeshift office with a battered desk, a few chairs, and walls plastered with blueprints and schedules. The silence inside was almost jarring. Frank settled into his seat behind the desk, pointing to a couple of chairs,
So what's this about?
his tone curious. Mike put his palms squarely on his knees.
We were both part of the occupation group in Rome. We worked with the Carabinieri. You served in Rome, right?
Frank offered a proud smile.
Yep, I'm a sapper. Worked a lot on temporary housing, fixing infrastructure, until the Italians could get to it. Why?
Dan exchanged a glance with Mike before answering.
The LAPD has asked us to talk to former servicemen. Some crimes have been committed in LA recently. We are convinced the culprit was in Rome, too.
Frank sat upright, his eyes darting between Dan and Mike.
What kind of crimes?
Dan held up a placating hand.
Mr. Hernandez, you're not a suspect. We just need to verify your whereabouts on 3 specific dates, and we'll be on our way.
Frank Hernandez thought about the request, then reached for a battered planner on his desk, flipping through the pages. He stopped his search, his hand hovering over the book. His eyes narrowed as he looked back up at Dan and Mike.
There must be 100 guys who were in Rome and are now in LA. Why me?
His tone grew sharper, suspicion creeping into his words. Dan sensed the shift in Frank's mood and tried to diffuse the situation.
Mr. Hernandez, we're just following up on a few questions.
In Rome, you had a few problems with women.
Mike interjected, hoping the information would satisfy him. It had the opposite effect. Frank's face twisted with rage, his eyes blazing. In a flash, he lunged across the desk. With a powerful left hand, he grabbed Mike by the back of the neck, pulling him close. His right fist cocked, ready to strike. Dan's hands moved with blinding speed, seizing Hernandez's right wrist and slamming it to the desk, where it stayed. Hernandez pulled on the arm Dan had clamped to the desk, a look of astonishment appearing on Frank's face when he realized he could not move it. The big construction boss hesitated.
Mr. Hernandez, let him go. Now!
Frank froze, stunned that someone had successfully challenged his strength. Reluctantly, he released Mike and glared at Dan. Frank's chest heaved with angry breaths. The atmosphere in the trailer crackled with stress as Dan released Hernandez. Mike straightened his uniform, his face impassive despite the close call.
Now, let's all take a deep breath and handle this easy. Can we do that, Frank?
Frank dialed down his anger just a bit. His jaw remained tightly clenched. Mike stretched toward the calendar resting on Frank's desk. The captain's motions measured and controlled despite the strained atmosphere that remained. He turned the sheets one by one, studying each notation with focus. His expression changed abruptly, his forehead creasing as he spotted a telling blank space in the timeline.
Mr. Hernandez, there seems to be nothing here for one day.
Frank was suddenly cautious.
What date?
He asked, still bristling with hostility.
Night before last.
Mike replied, watching Frank's reaction closely. Frank stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He strode to the door, yanking it open.
Matty!
He bellowed at the construction site. After about 20 seconds, a younger man appeared at the doorway, looking more than a little confused.
Manny, tell these men where we were the night before last.
Manny's face broke into a broad smile.
Oh, we were in Tijuana, boss.
his tone light and carefree. Mike wanted to know more.
And what were you doing in Tijuana?
Manny, uncertain, hesitated, his smile faltering as he looked at Frank.
Tell them.
Dipping our wicks, sir.
Manny said, his cheeks flushing slightly. Dan and Mike exchanged a look, taking in this new information. It seemed to satisfy their inquiry, and they began to gather their things, preparing to leave.
Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Hernandez.
Mike said formally, his tone betraying no hint of the earlier altercation. As they exited the trailer, Frank's fury finally exploded. He slammed the door behind them with such force that the flimsy structure broke and swung open on bent hinges. Chapter 12. The next stop for Dan and Mike was in Bel Air, where they sought out Paul Ringer, a former lieutenant who had served as a lawyer with the Judge Advocate General, attached to the Office of the Allied Occupation in Rome. He had been questioned by the Carabinieri about an assault on a clerk. The report said he got physical when the girl refused to go on a date. Despite the proximity of their offices during that time, Ringer's being just down the hall from Dan and Mike's, neither of them could conjure up a clear memory of the JAG lawyer. They drove through the streets of Bel Air, their eyes widening with each passing block. The two Orange County residents had heard about Bel Air's wealth, but reality was something different. Manicured lawns sprawled before lavish estates, each grander than the last. Towering palm trees lined the wide boulevards, their tiny branches swaying high overhead.
Jesus,
Dan said, pressing his face closer to the passenger window.
you ever seen anything like this, Mike?
As they turned onto another tree-lined avenue, the Ringer mansion came into view. The car slowed to a crawl as both men gaped at the imposing structure. Spanish Revival architecture blended seamlessly with craftsman influences, creating a vision of refined luxury. Mike guided the car up the sweeping driveway, past a series of sparkling white statues, recreations of those from ancient Rome. He pulled to a stop before the lavish entrance, cut the engine, and let out a low whistle.
Did you shine your shoes this morning?
Mike displayed a playful smile.
You can see your face in them.
They stepped out of the car, their shoes squeaking on the polished stone of the circular driveway. Dan took the lead, mounting the broad staircase with Mike a step behind. At the top of the stairs, Dan raised his hand to knock, but before he could make contact, the massive wooden door swung open. A middle-aged woman in a crisp maid's uniform answered the door. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, shifted between the two men.
May I help you, gentlemen?
Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Detective Dan Kelly, and this is Captain Mike Fiorante. We're here to speak with Mr. Ringer, if he's available.
Dan watched as the maid's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features.
No. He's at work.
Her words clipped.
And where does he work?
The maid hesitated, her eyes darting between the two men. Dan could almost see the internal debate playing out behind her eyes. Finally,
At his office. Carson, Miles, and Ringer on Wilshire.
Mike's pen scratched against his notepad. Dan offered a small smile of thanks.
Is Mrs. Ringer home?
The maid's hesitation this time was more pronounced. Dan's instincts, honed by years on the job, prickled. His eyes searched past the maid, surveying the vast entrance hall beyond. That's when he saw her. Half hidden in an archway stood an elegantly dressed woman in her 30s. She was motionless, her presence almost ethereal in the shadows. Before he could react, her voice, soft but clear, floated across the space.
It's all right, Jennifer. Gentlemen, please come in.
she said in a voice barely audible.
I'm Kathy Ringer. Paul is my husband.
Dan stepped inside with Mike close behind. The maid, Jennifer, retreated without a sound, disappearing down a hallway. Every inch of the interior of the Ringer mansion spoke to wealth and refined taste. Dan's eyes studied the space, taking in the marble floors, the crystal chandelier that hung from the vaulted ceiling, and the ornate furniture that adorned the chamber. To their left, a grand staircase curved upward, its mahogany banister polished to a high sheen. To the right, a large doorway led to an enormous living room, filled with plush sofas and antique side tables. Kathy Ringer stood in shadow at the far end of the foyer. Even so, she cut an elegant silhouette. Her tall, statuesque figure was accentuated by the soft light filtering through the windows, casting a gentle glow on her long red hair. Her presence commanded attention despite the weakness of her voice.
We're sorry to intrude. We were hoping to speak with your husband about his time in Rome after the war.
Of course.
Speaking with somewhat more force.
Paul isn't home at the moment, but perhaps I can help you.
That would be very kind of you, Mrs. Ringer.
Dan took off his hat, offering a polite smile as she approached, his look drawn to her lithe form. A shaft of bright light from the window above the door caught her hair, setting it ablaze with a coppery sheen. When she was fully in the light, she radiated elegance. As Mrs. Ringer moved closer, his expression changed, a subtle shift from polite interest to professional concern. She dropped her arms to her sides, the motion seemingly casual, but it revealed several dark, angry bruises tainting the pale flesh of her left arm. The marks stood out against her alabaster skin, telling a story of violence that Dan's eyes could not miss. Both sympathy and a need to protect this woman stirred in Dan, but he kept his composure. Dan's eyes took in all of Kathy Ringer, her beauty, her graceful movements, and the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from her. Despite her outward serenity, he sensed a well of pain hidden beneath the surface. It was there in the tightness around her eyes, the careful way she held herself as if bracing against an unseen force. He marveled at her ability to maintain such a placid exterior. Unexpectedly, Dan found himself thinking of Susan, his own wife, living in Washington. The physical distance between Redstone and the nation's capital seemed to mirror the emotional void that had grown between them. He loved Susan, of that he was certain. But with each passing month, the likelihood of them ever truly living as a married couple again was becoming increasingly remote. The realization brought an ache to his chest, of which he'd grown accustomed. Looking at Kathy Ringer, Dan was struck once again by the universal truth that everyone wears a mask, hiding parts of themselves from the world. He thought of the bruises on her arm, the story they told, that she was now ready for others to see. It was a harsh reminder that beneath a polished veneer of wealth and beauty, pain and torment could lurk. Dan exchanged a quick glance with Mike before turning back to Mrs. Ringer, who remained smiling. Mrs. Ringer gestured toward the living room. Mike, who had also seen the bruises marring Kathy's fair skin, cleared his throat.
May I use your telephone?
She smiled warmly and motioned toward the hallway. Mike stepped out into the hall and into the next room, where he found a phone on an end table. He dialed his contact with the LAPD. He waited, listening to the ringing until Senior Detective Colin Thacker picked up. He explained the situation, his hand covering his mouth to avoid being overheard. Mike urged Thacker to bring Paul Ringer in for questioning. Meanwhile, Dan and Mrs. Ringer, who asked to be called Kathy, sat across from one another in an elegant living room. The space between them was filled with unease as they talked quietly. On almost any other day, Dan would have been content to chat for a while with this beautiful woman in her luxurious home. But today was not any other day. Dan's thoughts drifted between Kathy Ringer's stunning appearance and the signs of abuse tarnishing her skin. The soft click of heels on the marble floor announced the arrival of Jennifer. She entered the room, balancing a silver tray laden with a delicate coffee service. She set the tray down on the polished side table, the china cups clinking gently. Though the marks on her arm were not discussed, Dan believed Kathy's intent was clear. She purposefully displayed her bruises to the police. Mike was about to return to the living room when Jennifer, the maid, approached him with an urgent look, catching him off guard. Without making a sound, she grabbed his forearms, her hand surprisingly strong as she pushed him backward. Mike found himself up against a wall, confused. He looked down at Jennifer, searching for an explanation. But she remained silent. Her eyes, filled with worry, locked onto his. A chill ran down Mike's spine as Jennifer's grip tightened, her fingers digging into his arms. With deliberate motion, she tilted her head and pointed with her eyes toward the living room, where Mrs. Ringer sat talking casually with Dan. Jennifer's face, etched with distress, spoke directly. She raised and lowered her chin in tiny, solemn motions, her eyes never leaving Mike's, wordlessly imploring him to see what was going on in this house. A wave of comprehension washed over Mike. He responded to Jennifer in kind with a tiny nod. At his acknowledgement, Jennifer's control fell apart. She released her grip on Mike's arms and fell forward, her body shaking with quiet sobs. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, seeking assurance in Mike's arms. Before Mike could fully react to offer any words of consolation or a comforting embrace, Jennifer straightened herself. She took a step back, wiping her eyes hastily and smoothing her uniform. From a few feet away, she turned back to Mike, offering a small smile of gratitude. Mike decided to let Dan finish with Kathy Ringer. He needed some air, some space to deal with what had just happened. Stepping out of the mansion, he made his way down the broad front stairs. He reached the car and used it for support, grateful for its solid presence. His eyes traveled up the facade of the Ringer mansion, taking in its grandeur and opulence. The stunning architecture, with its white stucco walls and terracotta roof, spoke of money and class. It was a picture of perfection, a dream home telling the world that those who lived here had it all. But Mike knew better now. He'd seen the bruises on Kathy's arm and felt the desperation in Jennifer's grip. The magnificence of this place was just a front, hiding the ugly truth within. Mike tilted his head back, letting the sun warm his face before exhaling a slow, weary sigh. His eyes never left the imposing structure before him as the difference between appearance and reality sunk in.
All the money in the world.
Mike communicated a message of disbelief that could be heard by no one. 10 minutes later, Dan emerged from the mansion, his face devoid of emotion. As he descended the stairs, his eyes locked on Mike, still leaning against the car. They had seen and felt the same things, and their eyes shared a common knowledge. He approached his partner and looked back at the looming house behind him to ensure they could not be overheard.
He beats her.
Mike's eyes indicated no surprise, only that he had reached the same conclusion.
Thacker is having Paul Ringer picked up.
His tone equally solemn. Dan was about to respond when Mike added more evidence to the charges.
The maid, she confirmed the beatings.
Surprise ran across Dan's face. His eyes widened as he regarded his partner.
You talked to her.
Mike's expression remained impassive. but there was a hint of something, perhaps sadness, perhaps anger in his eyes.
We had a conversation.
His tone left no space for questions.
I grew up in Queens. It was a tough neighborhood. Every once in a while you hear the sounds. Fighting, screaming. It was the way things were. Nobody ever told me that a wife beater could live in a house with crystal chandeliers and marble floors.
Chapter 13. Dan trudged down a barren corridor at LAPD headquarters. Mike kept pace beside him, both men feeling the burden of the day's revelations. As they turned a corner, Dan spotted Detectives Rice and Thacker waiting at the end of the hallway. Rice rested against a wall, arms crossed, his sharp eyes fixed on their approach. Thacker stood with his hands in his pockets, the stub of an unlit cigar jutting from the corner of his mouth.
"Gentlemen,"
Thacker said in his deep voice.
"long day?"
Tired, Dan looked back at the older detective.
You could say that.
Rice pushed off the wall, his lean frame uncoiling like a spring.
What'd you find out about Ringer?
Mike checked with Dan, then said,
It's not good. We're pretty sure he's beating his wife.
Thacker's thick black eyebrows knitted together.
"You got proof?"
Saw the bruises myself. When Kathy, Mrs. Ringer, showed me the bruises, she knew exactly what she was doing. And Mike, he had a conversation with the maid.
Rice's eyes narrowed, darting between Dan and Mike.
A conversation, huh? She willing to go on record?
Mike shook his head.
Doubt it. I think she's scared.
Thacker pulled the cigar from his mouth.
"Hold up. We brought Ringer in. Wilson's got him in interview room 2 right now."
Dan's muscles tensed. After the scene at Ringer's mansion, his mind filled with images of Kathy's bruises and her distant eyes.
"We'll see if he fits our timeline."
Rice's gaunt face betrayed no emotion.
Rich, lawyer like that? Used to being in control. Could be interesting to watch him squirm.
Dan followed the group down another corridor. Each step brought him closer to Paul Ringer, a man who might be their killer or might just be another abusive husband who needed to be dealt with. As they approached the interview room, the door swung open. Out stepped a well-dressed man in his 40s, a polite smile plastered on his face. The man's suit was impeccable, his tie perfectly knotted. He was followed by Detective Wilson, who shook the man's hand.
"Thank you for your time, Mr. Ringer. We'll be in touch if we need anything else."
Ringer seemed completely unconcerned, his eyes searching the hallway. He stopped, and his eyes locked onto Dan and Mike. Recognition flickered across Ringer's face. He hesitated, fidgeting with his tie. He focused on Mike Fiorante's uniform. Then it hit him. He shook an index finger in the air as if to say, "Aha!" Ringer's expression shifted, a slow, sly smile spreading across his features. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, leaving them cold and calculating. As he neared Mike and Dan, he spoke.
"Haven't seen you two since Rome."
The smile now broadened across his face. Sensing an impasse, Wilson suggested that Detective Rice could see Mr. Ringer out, and the two men walked away. As Ringer disappeared around a corner, a knot formed in Dan's gut. He turned back to Mike, Thacker, and Wilson. Mike's eyes were wide with disbelief.
What just happened?
Wilson shook his head.
"He has alibis. He was in Sacramento for the first killing and Santa Barbara for the third. At the symphony on the night of the second. We verified with his wife."
He beats his wife,
Mike said, cutting in, his voice rising with indignation. The words filled the hallway, drawing curious glances from passing officers. Dan winced, seeing sympathy and frustration on the other detectives' faces. He understood Mike's anger. Hell, he felt it too, but they needed to keep their cool. Thacker shifted his unlit cigar to the other side of his mouth.
Is she prepared to press charges?
The question hung in the air. Dan reluctantly shook his head.
No, not at this time. She did not actually say her husband beats her.
Mike was concerned about what might happen.
Did you ask him about his wife? He could retaliate if he suspects we're onto him.
Thacker sighed, moving closer to place his large hands on Mike's shoulders. The older detective's touch was reassuring, fatherly.
Son, this isn't our first rodeo.
His voice strong and steady.
No, we didn't mention her. We just asked about his whereabouts on the nights of the murders. Standard procedure.
Detective Wilson, the officer who had conducted the interview, stepped forward to confirm Thacker's statement.
He does not know what you saw, Captain,
Wilson said, his tone confident despite his relative inexperience.
Okay?
Mike held Wilson's gaze for a moment, searching for any hint of doubt. Finding none, he gave a gentle nod of thanks, some of the tension visibly easing from his body. A moment of quiet followed, broken only by the distant ringing of telephones and the shuffling of paper. Dan could see the wheels turning in Thacker's mind as he spoke the sad truth.
Nothing pisses me off more than a wife beater, but our hands are tied here.
He shifted the unlit cigar in his mouth.
Even if she did come forward, no DA would touch it. They see it as a family matter.
His face darkened.
35 years on the job, and these cases still eat at me.
Dan knew Thacker was right, and he was grateful for the veteran detective's support. He glanced at Mike, seeing his friend's jaw clench in barely contained frustration. Dan watched as Thacker's expression eased, the lines around his eyes crinkling with interest.
How was the rest of your day?
Mike pulled out his notebook, flipping through the pages, his energy low. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the captain's face as he began his report.
Frank Hernandez has some serious anger control issues, but he's not our guy.
He turned another page.
Paul Okafor? Well, he never made it back from Rome. Our records were wrong.
By the expressions on Wilson and Thacker, Dan realized they were indifferent. While Mike had been outraged that the Army had sent him to interview a dead man, for the two Los Angeles detectives, it was just grist for the mill. Mike continued his report.
You know about Ringer.
Mike was so beat that he did not bother to check Thacker and Wilson's reactions.
Then there's Burns. Wife says he travels constantly, especially to Denver lately. We'll need to follow up on that one. Phil Best wasn't home. Neighbors say the whole family's at their beach house up the coast.
Mike rushed through the remaining names on his list, his voice growing more monotone with each entry.
Bottom line, none of the ones we talked to fit our profile.
He extracted the pages from his notebook.
It's all there. Dan and I will keep digging on Burns and Best.
Dan could see some disappointment in Wilson's face as he accepted the notes. Day one of Dan and Mike's interviews was done, and they had nothing. Thacker's expression was gentle as he addressed them both.
Thanks, gents. We'll have more files for you soon.
Dan walked beside Mike toward the parking lot, both men lost in their thoughts after the long day. The weight of Ringer's smug smile and their overall lack of progress had made a long day longer. Dan was thinking about an Army buddy in Long Beach who might be in trouble. Mike was also thinking about friends from the war. Two sergeants back at Camp Carson who had been in Rome. He'd see what they could remember about the murder of Maria Albano. Chapter 14. Dan and Mike drove away from LAPD headquarters into the late afternoon air. The sun was beginning its daily dive into the Pacific Ocean. casting long shadows across the bustling streets of downtown Los Angeles. The lines on their faces were evidence of the hours they'd spent interviewing suspects. Dan rubbed his tired eyes and turned to Mike.
If you have a few minutes, I'd like to stop in Long Beach.
Sure.
Corporal Hinks, who showed up last night with the files?
Yeah, good kid,
Mike said, recalling the young soldier. Dan's expression softened, a hint of concern creeping into his voice.
His brother Mark was in my unit in Sicily. Want to check up on him?
Mike nodded in immediate understanding. There was a vet and a brother in arms who might be in trouble. Since last night, when Julius Hinks had stopped by Marty's house, Dan had been concerned for the young corporal's older brother, Mark. Though Julius hadn't explicitly mentioned anything amiss with Mark, Dan's instincts had picked up on an undercurrent of worry. Something was off, and it nagged at Dan. He couldn't shake the feeling that Mark might be struggling with the same demons that haunted many vets. It would take only a few minutes to swing by Mark's place in Long Beach and check on him, Dan reasoned. A quick welfare check to ease his mind, and more importantly, to ensure that a fellow soldier, a friend, was doing okay. The drive to Long Beach was quiet, both men lost in their thoughts. As they pulled up to a little house, the streetlights came to life, casting a yellow glow on the neighborhood. Dan lifted the simple brass knocker on the front door, the sound breaking through the stillness of the quiet suburban evening. Moments later, the door creaked open on its hinges, revealing Mark Hinks standing in the dimly lit entryway. At 35, he looked worn beyond his years. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss. But when his tired eyes landed on Dan, a transformation occurred. A smile exploded across his unshaven features. His face became warm and sunny, years melting away in an instant. The change was so sudden and dramatic that Dan found himself momentarily taken aback until he saw again the vibrant man he'd known in Sicily. Mark grasped Dan's hand, shaking it with vigor. Mike stood back, observing the reunion with a smile. The family resemblance between Mark and Corporal Julius Hinks was unmistakable. Dan made quick introductions, explaining his and Mike's shared history in Rome. Then, a funny story popped into his mind. He turned to Mike and began to recount a day by the sea in Sicily when he and Mark had... But as he spoke, the smile faded from Mike's face, replaced by an odd look. Confused, his words dying, Dan turned back to Mark. Mark's bearing had changed completely. The look of happiness at seeing Dan was gone. Tears were on his face, and he sobbed uncontrollably. In that moment, Mark's composure crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. Dan, overcome by a surge of emotion, pulled Mark into a fierce embrace, his arms wrapping tightly around his old buddy's trembling form. The detective's own eyes glistened with tears as Mark's body shuddered against him. Mike Fiorante, though a stranger to Mark, instinctively reached out and placed a comforting hand on the weeping man's shoulder. The captain's touch was a wordless act of understanding that spoke to a fellow soldier. On a modest street in Long Beach, 3 men stood frozen in a tableau of shared grief and unspoken memories as the years and the war bore down on them all.